All right. All right. Well, then I think in that case we're good to go. Okay. So, welcome Tamara. Tamara came to our professional development day last week, and we're now trying to butter her up and get her into the program. So we offered her, just as we did with the rest of you, we offered her to come in, Zoom in today and watch a little bit of class. Tomorrow, feel free to watch as much or as little as you like. It doesn't affect me if you go out. So feel free to stay or go as you choose. All right. So how's everyone doing week 4? Just doing okay? All right, so we've got just to do chapter 5 today. So I talked really briefly about the data analyses, and you said that Diego said he did something, he just doesn't know if he did it right. Mark's also not. Tolu, how did yours go? Yeah, it's pretty much the same. Okay, well that's good because it's the first one out of 3. And we prepped you as much as we could, but if we've got, issues, then we'll go through them for the next 2. So, but I'm delighted you just got to do it. Once you've done it, that's the major part. All right. So today we're going to talk for most of the time actually about first language acquisition. Why would we do that? Well, several reasons, but not least is the fact that most of initial L2 research comes from L1, right? L2 SLA as a field didn't really get its act together until the 60s and 70s, which for some of us, she says, looking at Mark, are within living memory. So, huh?
69.
Yeah. Sorry, Mark.
That's okay.
Okay, then that would just be me. It was well within living memory. So, that's a short period of time for any research tradition. So we start with this transition again. We're going to assume the transition between behaviorist models to the cognitive approach, right? So, and that's the sort of underlying foundation of all our stuff now. So what does the cognitive approach say? That language is a series of structured rules, that these rules are learned by children. I mean, not in the same way that we're learning this information, but that they're learned, not imitated. That they don't come out with a blank slate and then they imitate. And that they're learned via these innate principles. Does anyone remember what this thing was called? Good, the black box. Yeah, the LAD, language acquisition device or black box. This thing that's supposed to activate innate principles that then as soon as you get exposure to language, these principles and parameters start falling into place. And obviously you don't know that because you're 1, but that's what's going on. In the same way that a bird eventually, starts just flies or a dolphin swims, we start speaking. All right, so what's the evidence for this, particularly in first language acquisition? Well, if you remember when we looked at the behaviorist thing, the idea very simply was there's a doll, and the mother says doll and the child says doll, and if the child doesn't say doll properly, or doll, or whatever it is the Americans say, that they won't get the doll, or that the adult doesn't understand. But of course we know that's not true, right? Because what does the child do if they don't get the doll? I mean, how does a child that's, let's say, pre-linguistic. It's communicating with you, but it doesn't have words yet. How does it get the doll? Yeah, it cries and it points at the doll, or it grabs the doll, or it does whatever it wants to do. So, and still gets the doll. So we know that that very sort of simplistic, if I want it, I get it, and there's stimulus and response, and that helps me learn the language, is probably, you know, not correct. Also, when negative reinforcement is produced, children don't respond to it for the most part. And they gave you some examples of that, right, on 109, where the mother's saying, I don't see no trees, I don't see any trees, I don't see no trees, you know. So all of us have experience with this, either ourselves or our children or our nieces and nephews or whatever, that children don't respond necessarily. So when we were children, my sister couldn't say car, well, wouldn't say car park, which is our version of parking lot, right? She would say park. And my parents would say, you mean car park? And she would say park. Yeah. And I remember it really well. And to the point where now I sort of think park is fairly normal as opposed to car park. I have to really think to say car park. And it didn't matter how many times my parents said this, she wasn't having any of it, right? So pretty much the only thing that we insist that our children learn, and they do in fact respond to, what can we think it might be? In terms of language instruction, we do try and instruct one system. No. There's one language system that we do get on our children about. No. One language system that we get on them about, Diego, and they actually have to learn to respond to. Think of the language systems that there are. So far we've been through two of them, syntax and phonology. What else? Right, no. No. Which leaves you with? Yeah. That's about the only thing that we actually teach our children. So we will say to them, you must say please, right? So what should you say? No, they say, give me. I say, what should you be saying? Give me that. And they have to say it, right? Or in my case, when I was young, my uncle appeared and he was the first person I'd seen with no hair. So I was like, oh, mommy, look, he's got no hair. And my mummy took me to one side and said, we don't talk about things like that in polite, you know, so that's not. So that is essentially part of the systems of relational uses of language, of pragmatics. That's the one thing that we do get on our children for. But if you get on them for syntax or phonology, up until a certain age, it's just not worth the bother, right? So also we know that there's systematic development over time, including error patterns. So this is another thing that makes you think children can't possibly just be imitating what they hear, right? Because they tend to generalize patterns. We talked about pattern generalization last week of goed, for example, or cummed. I cummed, I goed, because children want to regularize that pattern. They learn that ED means past tense and they want to regularize it to everything, right? And they have to learn not to. Well, if they were just copying what they heard, they wouldn't say goed, they would say went, right? They would have it imprinted already that it was irregular. And last, that this kind of systematicity appears across language systems, so across syntax, across phonology, across morphology. we're not presenting our children with every single thing all of the time. Over and above really stupid examples like when your 2.5-year-old says, "I hate you, mummy," and you think, well, I didn't teach them that. So yeah, so we know that there's just too much evidence that there's something going on that's inside. It's not all coming from the outside. So let's think about L1 development. We start, and this is of course a sort of standardized idea. Anybody who's at home who's thinking, my baby's 11 months and not using CV syllables, please don't panic. There's nothing wrong with that. This is just the kind of standardized average of when, generally speaking, it's the, what's the one in the middle? Not the mean, the median, right? So it's the sort of, you know, around this general time. So some babies will be a lot earlier and some babies will be a lot later. So there isn't anything that I say here that I want you to concern yourself with your child or grandchild. Generally speaking, in a median sort of way, 0 to 6 months, we've got sort of general cooing and crying. And then somewhere around 6 to 10 months, we move to what's called babbling. And babbling means basically open syllable structure. So CV syllables. So ba, da, right? Ga. It usually starts with stops. So what would that be? I just did them, yeah, right. Ba, voice stops. So ba, da, ga, right? Sometimes with nasal stops, ma. But the fact that they say da for dad before they say ma for mum is nothing about love, but only about the simplicity of producing stops as opposed to oral stops, as opposed to nasal stops. So, and then by about 12 months, if not before, somewhere between that time, the babbling, so the CV open syllables, begin to sort of sound like they mean something. Like they're asking you a question, or they're saying, they're making an exclamation, you know, that they have some prosodic, which means intonation, stress, and rhythm, that makes it sound like they're saying something specific. Okay. Now, there is a great video that which I'm hoping is going to play. Did we check any of these? Okay, good. Am I going to do it straight from here? Yeah. Okay. This was actually listed in your book, but it was too much fun, so. Okay, we're not going to watch it for 2 minutes, but you get the general idea. That is classic babbling plus intonation and some non-verbals. I'm not sure what the leg was, but there was all of this stuff that makes it sound like they're talking, right? And it's because we have a systematic meaningful set of intonation patterns, some which read question, some which read statement, that they're sort of using in that. But of course, we don't assume that they actually, I mean, I don't know much about twins, but I don't think they're actually saying anything to each other. I would be very surprised. Okay, how do I go back? Okay. Okay. Ooh. Oh, I forgot that. Right. And then at some point during this move from babbling to first words, we sort of get wordy like things, right? And there's sort of various opinions on what's an actual word. Like, when do babies really work out that they're segmenting speech? It's called the segmentation problem. And it's the idea of when does it sound like they're saying a word versus when they might have actually worked out that the speech stream is segmented into different places, right? And there's various tests and things. Now, I completely forgot my example for the Gavagai mapping problem. I have a multicolored hedgehog, which I normally use, but sure, I'll use this instead, which is less fun. But so the mapping problem, which was sort of put out by philosopher Quine, is this. If I hold this up, I don't speak your language, and I hold this up and I say, Gavagai, what do you think I'm saying? How would you translate that?
This is a Gavagai.
Yeah, but what do you think Gavagai means then?
Water bottle.
Okay, you think it means water bottle? Does everyone think it basically means water bottle? Okay, so, but of course, what else could it mean?
Water.
It could mean water, right? What's inside? It could mean bottle with no water. It could mean blue. It could mean any of those things, right? And this is called the mapping problem, meaning as a child, a baby is learning language, how do they learn what a word, a given word, semantic word, maps onto, right? And what they find all the time is that children say exactly what Diego said, which is water bottle, right? Meaning what we call the whole object principle. Children naturally don't try and break this down, okay? They say, they look at it as a whole object and try and come up with whatever that label is. They don't seem to go through their brain saying, well, does he mean water? Does he mean bottle? Does he mean, you know, they automatically go for what we call the whole object. So, yeah, that's the mapping problem. And the mapping problem is yet another support for innate principles. Why? Why would that be? The fact that we have something called the whole object principle, we know what children, how children map when they see an object and they hear the language. Why would that be another support for innate structures of language? Tamara, this is the only thing that sucks about being in class. You get to have to answer my questions. There's 19 other people out on the internet watching this right now or watching this tomorrow, and they don't have to answer any of my questions. They just get to see everybody in here struggling. Don't make it too hard. Well, think about it.
If they all do it the same way, that suggests that there's something shared.
That's exactly right. That's it. If they all are doing it the same way, if it wasn't, you know, if one kid says that's water and another kid says that's a water bottle, right? You know that they're doing it individually, right? The fact that we have a whole object principle across languages, like a kid from another language would say, that's the whole object. When she gives me the name of a, so Gava guy comes from the fact that he showed people pictures of a rabbit from all over the world. And people always said the same thing. And the rabbit is running, right? The picture of the rabbit is running. Everybody always said exactly the same thing. Gava guy means rabbit. No one said it's a rabbit running, it's big ears, it's a pointy nose, it's, you know, everybody said, I assume that you mean rabbit, okay? All right, so first words can do a lot of different things, and we sort of saw that with the babbling, right? So first words can be questions, demands, all kinds of things, and that's done with their intonation, right? So they might say, Dada, and we automatically go with what we assume, you know, who knows whether they really mean, where's Daddy? But that's what we say, so we reinforce that, right? Dada's at work, he'll be home in a little bit, right? Mama, you know, or apple, right? And we assume, then we say, oh, they want an apple, right? But we do know that there's lots of over and under extension. Again, what that implies is that there's a system and that they're working through the system, okay? So overextension is things like, if you have a word like doggy, they end up calling anything with 4 legs doggy, you know? So if they see a cat, they say doggy, you know. Sometimes if they see like a push cart or something like that, they'll say doggy, you know, anything that sort of moves along in that kind of way, or anything that has a kind of button nose like a dog has, all those kind of things. And again, the whole object principle applies. So they won't take a piece of the cat and say, you know, they'll say that cat is a doggy. Under extension is the underuse of something. So basically what you're doing, what children are doing is working out the ontology of the world, right? What we would call the ontology of the world, the way the world works, okay? So for a child, a tree, you know, without leaves is not necessarily the same thing as a tree with leaves, right? Because it looks different, okay? So they have to learn that part of the ontology of the world is a state, like something can change states, right? So for a very small child, ice is a completely different thing from water, right? And then they learn, as they learn the ontology of the world, i.e. the way that the world works, they learn that they are two things in different states. Now, you can imagine how complicated, you only have to think about it for 2 seconds to see how complicated this must be. Because in that case, I call it ice or water, but it's the same thing. Just one's frozen, one isn't. But with a tree without leaves and a tree with leaves, it's still a tree. It's not like a tree versus something else, trip or something, like, you know. So you have to work out as a small child how meaning is attached to whole objects and changes state and so on. So there's a lot of learning to do, right? When you're, and this, by the way, is one of the reasons why comparing first language acquisition to second language acquisition is such a bad idea. In the sense of just saying that first acquisition, L1 acquisition and L2 acquisition, like it says in your book, somebody came up with the L1 equals L2. Why is it such a bad idea?
Because there's differences. Like we went over last time, there's the equivalency, the differentiation.
Yeah, good.
that don't always transfer across the language.
Right. But also think about it just from the basis of working out the ontology of the world, okay? By the time, while you're learning your first language, you're learning how the world works. You're learning that there's things that stay still and things that move, right? You're learning that there's things that can be in one state or another state, but they're still the same thing, right? You're learning all these kinds of things, all of which by the time you get around to your L2, you've learned already. So in other words, the information in your L1 is contextualized in a way that's completely integral to your environment. You know, you have to learn not only the thing, but also the notions of space, the notions of up, the notions of down, the notion you can fall, all of these things you're learning integrally, that's so not a word, with the language, okay? Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is going to come up again because what's called connectionism or neo-behaviorism is the idea that this LAD, this black box, doesn't have to exist. You don't have to have this architecture. The way we could be doing it is literally by our experience in the world. So that's something we're going to come up with again. Okay, so then let's go to individual systems. So this, again, with individual systems of morphology, phonology, and syntax, one of the real issues is segmentation, right? So you just did this data analysis. One of the first things that we said was what? About the Japanese girl, for example. Time 1, she looked like she was awesome. Time 2, not so awesome. And what did you sort of generalize from that?
She's using both phrases as if they were one word.
Good. She's using whole phrases as if they were one word, right? She couldn't segment the phrase at the beginning. And this is something that we know that kids do with everything, okay? So they also do it with phonology. They start usually with the syllable, the level of the syllable, and then they sort of backtrack towards the phoneme, right? Yeah, and then they often, as they're backtracking, they point this out to their parents. I don't know how well you guys can see it here, in here. I don't know if Tamara can see it at all. But this is a guide to consonant production. So this is the average age in which a child, an English child, learns specific consonants, right? So this is the consonants and this is the age. So between 2 and 3, we would expect them to have the stop system, including the nasal stops, pretty much down. And then, so we move forward. Now notice what's at the end, what could be right at the end. Like the two, what are these two? Thetas, good. The voiced and the voiceless theta, right? So, in fact, it's not uncommon for children to be put in speech therapy at the age of like 4 or 5 because they're still not saying the voiced and voiceless theta. But in fact, we know that that can sort of go on and on and on. That doesn't mean that they'll never be able to say it, but it can go on for a long time. So this is a rough kind of guide to individual segments. So what we know is that little kids start by doing these babbling, these open syllables, and then they sort of go back and rework out some of these individual consonants. So they're usually selective about what they try out. They'll avoid things they don't like. If there's a consonant that they don't like, they'll pick another one. They just sort of simplify things and go by their preference. The way that they simplify production, there's some examples below. So substitution would be one. So instead of using a lateral like r or l, because they don't like those at the very beginning, they might say wabbit, right, instead of rabbit, because it's easier to use that glide. They might use stops instead of fricatives. So instead of saying so, it comes out more like do. Assimilation, they love assimilation. For example, reduplication, like Kiki, like the one we have here. And they like omitting things. So they might omit final consonants or omit consonants in clusters. So we can see that there's a developmental pattern basically in phonology. A kid just doesn't sort of at 1 they don't say anything, and then at 3 they say everything fabulously, or at 4 they say everything fabulously. We know that there's a development over time. That's our consonant production chart. Syntax. Okay. So syntax, as we said, well, you know, there's a sort of differing opinion about exactly when something turns from being a babble to a word. And that's at least partially because often words are chunks, unanalyzed chunks, like all gone is a typical unanalyzed chunk that a child might use, which means everything is gone. You know, they finished their milk or they finished their whatever. And we can pretty much guarantee when we have all gone that they're not saying it's all gone. They're literally saying all gone. Like, that's my way of telling you that the milk is finished. And from there, you tend to move to what we call telegraphic speech, which is sort of like me, Tarzan, you, Jane, or E.T., go home, right? That's typical telegraphic speech. By the way, one of the reasons that they tried to make him even more childlike, you know, and by giving him this sort of, you know, E.T., right? Yeah, by giving him this sort of telegraphic speech that makes him sound, and these great big eyes, and the combination makes him sound like a cute little toddler. And the way that we do it for children, the way that we show syntactic development is by something called mean length of utterance. So it's the amount of words produced in each utterance. So what we know, as you move from 1 to 2 words to telegraphic speech to less telegraphic speech, your mean length of utterance, MLU, increases. Now this works great with kids, but it doesn't work great with second language adults. Why might that not? Why might that be?
Adults might have a conscious attempt at using more words than they can or need to. Precisely.
Adults want to say actual sentences, right? They don't want to say apple or give apple, right? They're very conscious of the fact that they're an adult and they should be saying more than that. So we don't use MLUs to assess adult second language, because we know that in adult second language, they're going to try and be, it's not a question of going from a 1-word stage to a 2-word stage. But for kids, it is, right? And remember, for your second language kids that you just did this analysis from, it isn't an MLU either, okay? So they give you a example of syntactic development on page 115. They give you question formation. which starts with stage 1 of intonation, as I said, cookie, data, right? So this is one of the reasons, along with the sucking experiments that we talked about last week, that the idea is that prosody, so intonation and stress, is learned in utero. Okay, they already have some control of this idea of how you use meaningful prosody from hearing it in utero. Again, intonation with sentence complexity. And then finally, stage 3, 4, 5, you get the syntactic development, right? The kind of stuff that you were looking at in your data analysis, okay? Doing okay? All right. So, next system is morphology. And I think everyone now has done 555 and 501. Yeah. How many grammatical morphemes are there in English?
8.
Yes! There are 8 grammatical morphemes. You just read that, didn't you? He's the only one who's young enough, who's got good eyes to see 8 English grammatical morphemes. Okay. So who can tell me anything about morphology in English? I'll take anything.
It's based off Latin.
Okay, some of it is. Not all of it is. Oh, you mean the description of it? Yeah, that's true. The description of morphology is based off of Latin categorization. That is absolutely true. There are 2 kinds of morphology. Derivational and inflectional.
Yes.
You guys learn this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Years ago.
Does anyone have any memory of what the difference is between derivational and inflectional?
Yes. Inflectional
Diego, you're on fire today. Yeah.
doesn't actually change the core meaning of the word. It just changes how it's used. While derivative creates an entirely new word with a different meaning.
Derivational, not derivative.
Oh, sorry.
Derivational. But you are on fire. That is exactly correct. Good. So derivational are things that can change the meaning, such as, for example, un, right? Because un changes something from happy to unhappy. So it completely changes the meaning, right? Or well, can we think of another one? Another derivational suffix? Affix, prefix. Huh? Miss? Yeah, good. So misunderstand, right? So either you understand or you misunderstand. It's completely different notion. The 8 inflectional affixes change the syntax. So they change the grammatical meaning, but they don't change the semantics. Okay, they're there to function for the grammar. Okay, so the 8 ones that you have here are plural, marks as more than 1, possessive, so S and so you have regular and irregular, so dogs, cats, sheep, children, possessive, Ben's, Homer's, comparative, marks for comparison, so ER, right? So white, whiter than, whitest. Superlative, which is the whitest, coldest. So it would be cold, colder, coldest would be the regular thing. Then 3rd person present agreement. So that would be what am I trying to say? He walks. Okay, it'd be the S on walks. So I walk, you walk, he, she walks. Right, you have to put that little S on. Past tense, regular, ED. Okay, and then we have irregular forms too. Past participle, also changes. So that's choose, chose, chosen, for example, which is what you have here. Wake, woke, woken. Irregular, obviously. And then present participle, ing. And they're the 8 standard inflectional morphemes in English. Why do you care?
Are there non-standard?
Huh?
Are there non-standard?
No, well, there's other things that people put in the grammatical morpheme category that you'll see, that you saw in your reading. For example, articles.
Okay.
That was included in your, but they're not actually, you know, when we say how many inflectional morphemes do we have, we say we have 8 inflectional morphemes, but then there was at least 2 other things that they included in here. I forget exactly what they are now. Pronoun and article, you know, which actually wouldn't be on a typical 8 inflectional morpheme list. Okay. And this is where we got into the BSM, bilingual syntax measure. But before we do that, let's look at the WOG test. So basically, to assess whether how children's syntax is developing, they developed this WOG test, which says, can a child correctly form answers to questions like on the bilingual syntax measure? So 1 WOG, 2 WOGs, right. If a child can say 2 WOGs, we assume that they have acquired the plural, you know, the plural noun, right? Here. So then you can do it, you can maybe change WOG into a verb, right? And you say, what did he do yesterday? He WOG'd, right? And that shows that a child has understood the regular form of the past tense, right? So they had a lovely little link to a WOG test. Now, the WOG test started in the 1960s, so this is an old video, but it's still very cute.
So I'm here with Jean Burko-Gleason, and she's going to administer the WOG test on me to see if I am smarter than a child.
This is a WOG, okay? Now there's another one. There are 2 of them. There are 2
WOGs.
WOGs is good, and even very young children would say WOGs. What would you call a very tiny WOG?
A WOGette.
WOGette is a very good adult answer. Adults say WOGette, WOGling, WOGgy. Young kids don't. They all say quite uniformly, baby WOG. This is a man who knows how to zib. What is he doing? He is
Zibbing.
zibbing. That's the progressive form of the verb. You got it, and every kid gets it too. What would you call a man whose job is to zib?
A zipper.
Zipper is a good adult answer. Adults know that ending, like bake, baker. Young kids don't know that. They uniformly say he's a zib man. You pass. You have adult-like control of the English morphological inflectional system.
I love that movie. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Okay.
I think Spanish is taking over because I was wanting to say Moxito.
Oh. So you see how that applies to this, right? So the plurals, that we don't have the ER, but we have the present participle. And that, so basically the idea is, if you can show some consistency to how children develop these inflectional grammars, their inflectional morphemes, then you're showing development of grammar, right? And if you can show that most children develop it the same way most of the time, then what are you saying?
It's systematic, and there's something else that's not learned.
Good. It's systematic. It is not controlled by their input. You can't, by their specific input. It doesn't matter if you, Diego, who are father of a baby or a small child, say walking or don't say walking, right? Your child still, by a certain age, develops the ability to use that present progressive, right? So it must mean that somewhere in all the input that they're getting, all the children are learning certain things in a certain order, right? Which suggests that their brain is controlling the order, right? As long as the input comes in, obviously if you have no input whatsoever, if you're like Jeannie and you're on your own, or Nell, whatever that movie was, if you have a situation like that, then that's an abnormal situation. But assuming you have a normal situation, i.e. a normal amount of input, if this is happening in a specific way for everybody, then it doesn't matter whether it's Diego talking to them or Mark talking to them, right? Once they've got the input, they're going to do the same thing with it. So that summary is on 1617, and let's have a look at that real quickly. So 116 children go through the same developmental stages, although not necessarily at the same rate. Children create systematicity in their language and develop rules to govern their language knowledge and language use. The rules that are developed do not necessarily correspond to the rules of the adult language. There's overgeneralization of grammatical morphemes. So that's the idea of cummed and goed in the past tense. There are processing constraints that govern acquisition and use. Correction does not always work, hence my sister's park. And language acquisition is not determined by intelligence. What does that mean?
All children, regardless of
their
intelligence level.
All children, regardless of their quote-unquote intelligence level, whatever we mean by that, learn to speak the language to a similar degree. Now, don't confuse that with literacy. Literacy is a learned skill. It's something else entirely. We know that not all children sadly manage to achieve the same rate of literacy. But all children can do that basic thing that we talked about right at the beginning that Jeannie couldn't do. They can take a sentence like, what said dog white A, and tell you that that is ungrammatical, right? And that is what we mean by language acquisition. Okay, any questions thus far? Okay, about time for a break? You guys ready for a break? Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break, cigarette break, chocolate break, whatever. Oh no, I forgot to bring the chocolate. Oops.